they will unconsciously find a way to punish the people around them as a way of passing some of that energy on. And the hardest part about this is that in the moment, the narrative in their mind will make sense and will justify that action. Okay, big topic today. I am talking about projection and the fact that anything that we believe is not reality, and how truly understanding this and being able to see it and knowing how to navigate that is the key to allowing us to forge healthier relationships and actually navigate our lives a lot easier. This is complex. This is going to be quite a long video, but I spent the whole summer thinking about this, and I believe that I have quite a solid and cohesive framework to be able to share with you. I want to start with the science as well. You know, I really want this to be provable and useful to people. So to start with, what I want to express is the mechanisms at play in your mind when you are interpreting any situation in which you find yourself. And so far as I can see, there are at least 3 separate mechanisms or experiences that take place in any scenario that we might find ourselves. Now, the first one of these is the objective facts of whatever that moment is, whatever those facts are. Now, these facts are almost impossible for us to know completely because everything that we experience is filtered through our own perspective, our own lens. And that filtering that takes place happens in 2 different stages. The first of those stages happens within the more central, the lizard brain and the limbic system, the older part of our brain that is responsible for our emotions and our emotional reactions to different situations in which we find ourselves. Now, I'm going to massively oversimplify this just for the purposes of communicating in this video, but you can think of your emotional reaction to most situations being this almost instantaneous positive or negative. You know, it although there is more nuance than this, fundamentally it is, do I want more of this situation or do I want less of this? So you can take that back to, you know, some of the earliest life forms. You might have an emotional response towards food, which is moving towards that thing, versus an emotional response towards danger, which is moving away from it, right? So like a reaction, instantaneously, our limbic system brings up an emotion that tells us whether or not we like the situation in which we find ourselves. Momentarily after that, the neocortex, which is the more mammalian, the later part of our brain, then gets involved to create like a narrative or explain the reason why we've had that emotional response. Now, this is where we get into a lot of trouble, actually. And let's go back again to you know, an early ancestor, some primitive life form, hundreds of millions of years ago, and say we're this little mammal, this little tree-dwelling monkey type thing, and we're out on the edge of the branches on the outskirts of our tree, and a snake is there, and we get attacked by this snake. So our initial response is fear, and it moves us away from that vicinity of this danger. Until that neocortex developed, that might be the extent of understanding of that situation. But as the neocortex started to develop, it enabled us to have more nuance in understanding what about that situation was positive or negative. So, for example, it might come to mind that it's dangerous to be out on the edge of the tree when it's dark. It might be, oh, if I see a pattern that looks like that shape, like the diamonds on the back of a snake, like that's what's dangerous, right? And so the neocortex is looking out for the more subtle cues as to what a certain situation means and why it is positive or negative or whatever that emotion that arose was. All well and good. But modern society and modern world is so complex that our neocortex can't keep up with trying to assimilate all of this information that's available to actually figure out what really is the cause of this emotional response. And at some level, because we were prey animals in our ancient history, at some level it doesn't need to be too precise, because it can be, well, I just know that it's not good to be in that area this time, and so it doesn't really matter what the story is, I'm just going to keep this being away from there to keep it alive. So now we have this device that is responding to our emotions and trying to formulate the most convincing story about why we have had that emotional response. And it is using all of the previous narrative, all of our previous conditioning, all of our previous trauma, our education, everything that's come before, and it is combining that with this situation that we find ourselves and trying to make the most believable story. But when you're in a society where there is apparent danger all over the place and we're watching news of things happening all over the world, very often this neocortex is attributing the danger to things that aren't in our immediate vicinity. It is trying to make a narrative that's believable and enables us to navigate the world in a way that makes sense. And the modern world really doesn't make that much sense. I'm going to give you some examples of how this pattern in our brains can trip us up, because we're all doing it all of the time. And I want you to see just how messed up our beliefs are about the way the world works, okay? So I'll give you the first example. If you've had a shitty day at work and your boss is taking you for granted, really not respecting you, and you've just had enough, you leave the office and you're on your way home, and all you can think about is getting a beer, lying down on the sofa, slobbing out, watching a film, and just getting some rest, yeah? You're feeling frustrated, you're feeling disrespected. So you get to the front door and you put the key in the door, and as you open it and you walk in, the kids are jumping up and down on the sofa and they're screaming and shrieking and they're running all over the place. And you can feel this frustration rise up in your body, and you shout at the kids and you say, "You kids, you're always doing this. Never get a moment of peace and quiet," right? So what's happened in this situation is you were feeling frustrated, you were feeling taken for granted. And in that moment, the residual emotional experience in your body was already that emotion. And as you walked in the door, your neocortex was looking for something to blame for that emotional feeling. And the stimulus of your kids jumping around was a believable narrative for you to be able to disperse some of that emotional energy. And the way that you punish your kids will be to make them feel the way that you were feeling, because all your body cares about is finding equilibrium in its system of the emotions that are going on there. And unless you're aware enough to see that that's happening, we all know that we can be snarky to people who we don't really mean to be, when we're already in a negative emotional state. And this is what's happening. We feel the emotion already. The emotion is there. And then our neocortex is looking for something to blame and looking for somewhere where we can pass that emotion off onto someone else, so that we don't have to hold the full weight of that emotional burden by ourselves. I want to replay that situation for you again, and I don't want to change anything at all. We're going to play it exactly the same. You've had a shitty day at work, your boss has been taken advantage, you feel disrespected, and as you're walking home, all you're thinking about is lying on that sofa, having a beer, chilling out, watching a film. And in that moment, as you put the key into the door and you turn the key, you get a text. And the text says that you've won the lottery, right? So now, as you open the door, your emotional state is completely changed, right? You're absolutely buzzing, you know? You're completely flying, you're full of energy. And what happens is you dive right in with the kids and you're all screaming and you're jumping up and down off the furniture, right? So it's your internal emotional state and your expectations at the time that dictate the way that you then respond. When you are feeling exhausted and frustrated and disrespected, and your expectation is, I just want to lie on the sofa, then your response is because the stimulus is not giving you what you wanted. The kids jumping around on the sofa has interrupted your expectations, and the emotional state that you were already carrying is what you then project onto the kids. In the second situation, your emotional state has changed, and then when you go into that situation, you are taking that with you, and you respond in a completely different way, right? And so the narrative that the neocortex created in the first situation is it was the kid's fault, and you blame them. And the second situation, the narrative that it created was, we're millionaires, we're gonna have a fucking great evening, okay? And so every moment of your life, this process is happening where your emotional state, all the anxiety, everything else that you're picking up from everything around you is having an underlying effect in your system. And then you are looking at the situations in your life and you are filtering them through the lens of that underlying emotion. And then you are deciding the meaning of all of those situations based on that emotion. You can't trust your thoughts. This is like fundamental spiritual teaching because the thoughts are not real, okay? And this is really hard to accept, particularly when we start getting into more intense situations, because of course, sometimes we might be in a situation where someone's actions have caused that emotion. When someone has done something negative towards us, absolutely, they might be the cause of that underlying emotion, right? But you have to understand that anyone who is blaming someone else in any way is doing so because of their underlying emotion, right? If I have deep, deep shame about myself, if I have real hatred within me, and it's so much that I can't bear it, my neocortex is going to look for opportunities to offload some of that emotion onto people around me, right? And this is the saddest thing in the world, it really is. But parents who carry deep shame that they haven't processed, who are very likely alcoholics or addicts in some way, all trying to deal with this emotion that they can't hold by themselves, these people will offload that onto their kids. They will project it onto their kids. And so the kid could be doing the slightest thing or even nothing. But if the emotion is within the adult and their neocortex is trying to find an excuse to offload it, they will unconsciously find a way to punish the people around them as a way of passing some of that energy on. And the hardest part about this is that in the moment, the narrative in their mind will make sense and will justify that action. That doesn't make the action okay in any way. But in that moment, something in their narrative made it believable that that action was deserved. All the evil in the world is perpetrated like this. It's people believing those thoughts on face value and feeling justified in offloading their uncomfortable emotion, right? I think it was Nietzsche that said, he who fights monsters should take care that he doesn't become a monster himself. And what he's getting at here is when we feel justified in fighting someone because of something that they did, we can very quickly end up doing the same because we end up projecting our own pain and our own rage and taking that out on someone else, right? And So I can understand that sounds justified, right? If someone has done something to you, but this is just a chain going back and back throughout the whole of human history, that whatever has been unprocessed in a person gets projected onto someone else. And as I said, their narrative justifies it in the moment that that's acceptable. Now, very possibly, they might suddenly have regret once they see the results of their actions. They may even feel even more shame, and actually possibly, if they have some deep toxic shame in there and they do something harmful to you, they might shame themselves even further, and then they might punish you again for that shame again, right? But unless they have the awareness and the tools to be able to move through and process that emotion, their narrative in some way justifies their actions, right? And you can see this in someone that you know is in a lot of pain, and you can see they're like a boiling pot, right? Their emotion is up to here and they can't let it out, and they're terrified of expressing their grief or their anger, and they take out on everyone around them, because their system is looking for believable excuses to pass some of that energy onto people, and they will throw out little barbs and they will have digs and they will insult people, because it's their system trying to find equilibrium and trying to clear some of that emotion that they just can't hold by themselves. I want to give you another example of what that looks like, because these wounds come from childhood, right? And we all carry some level of this. Anytime we get defensive in an argument and we try and divert the blame, that is an example of this. You can think of a kid where they get caught doing something that they know they shouldn't, right? They've just eaten the chocolate cake. Cake is all over their face. They're completely caught red-handed. But in that moment, when you say, "Did you eat the cake?" they will try anything to get away with it, right? And they'll come up with all sorts of silly excuses, because the shame is the most uncomfortable and it's the heaviest emotion, and our system will do anything to avoid feeling that shame. And so they'll come up with all these different excuses and different ways to try and wiggle out of it and not feel that shame. If we grew up and we didn't have an adult that helped us effectively self-soothe and be able to sit with uncomfortable emotions while we process them, we are a lot more likely to react in this way. And as I said, anytime that you get defensive in an argument and you try and divert, that is an example of this. I think most people have some residue of this kind of response. And I'll give you an example from myself recently. I had a situation come up in relation to money, and I felt a lot of shame around feeling like someone was going to see that I didn't have my shit together in the way that I would like at this point in my life, right? And it brought up a huge amount of shame for me, and to the point where I was pretty much shaking trying to sit with this. And in my mind, all these stories came up, all these narratives came up for me to try and avoid feeling this shame, and my brain wanted to blame other people. Then it started looking for ways that I could get out of this situation, including forging bank documents and things like this, as a way of escaping holding this uncomfortable emotion. And I feel very fortunate and privileged that I'm doing my psychotherapy training, that I was able to spot this in action. And what I did was I actually sat down and had to say to myself, who do I want to be and how do I want to act in my life? And I had to use that as a framework to allow me to behave differently, right? If I trusted those thoughts on face value, I would have just done anything to avoid feeling that discomfort and tried to wiggle out of that feeling. But for me, a couple of my core values that I'm trying to work on is just as truth as much as possible, and integrity in any situation. And for me, in that situation, it meant owning up and saying honestly my situation, even if that meant massive rejection and me getting dashed on the rocks, right? It was, I'm going to stick and stand up for those values and behave in a way that's truthful, even if the worst thing happens, right? So if we are believing our thoughts on face value and we are responding in that way, that is how we can end up in these horrendous situations where we can hurt people very badly because we can't control those thoughts, Those thoughts arise unconsciously. While I'm talking to you, I'm not going in there and finding every single word that I'm going to speak, right? The thoughts arise on their own. If you think about free will and if you think about your level of consciousness, actually, all that really comes down to is your ability to override the impulsive thoughts that arise from your unconscious and all your conditioning and your traumas and all your education and everything else that's happened in your life up until this moment. So all it comes down to is when those thoughts arise, whether or not you act on them. The word conscience sounds like consciousness because your conscience is your vision of a higher ideal that you aspire to, that you can interrupt those thoughts as they arise and choose to behave in a different way. And so every moment, if we're all on autopilot most of the time because it is too psychologically and energetically taxing to be slow down enough to be able to interrupt those instinctive thoughts in every moment, right? And that's fine if your life is functional and if you're not hurting anyone and things are going well, then your frameworks and your constructs of reality are functioning well. You can rely on that instinctive behavior. But if you are messing up your life in any form, or if you are hurting anyone, you really do need to slow down and start questioning those thoughts as they arise, because somewhere in there's some unhelpful framework that you are living out. And this is, all healing work comes down to this, really. It's the perspectives that we believe about the way the world works. They're not real, As I said, they're just the constructs from our neocortex trying to make sense of this fucking absolute chaos that's happening all around us. And if you believe that to be reality, you'll be constrained to that tight psychological box that you will live within. When you're in therapy, whenever someone has a breakthrough, very often you'll hear someone say, oh, I never thought about it like that. And what's happening there is this was a perspective and this was the frame of reality that you were living within, which is the construct of all of that stuff in your neocortex. And suddenly you realize that that's not objectively true and you find your way to a bigger perspective that then allows you more freedom and it allows you to function better, I could talk about this stuff a lot, and there's a lot more I want to get into about projection and the mechanisms at work here, because as I said, understanding that our beliefs about the way the world works are not real. They are at best a functional framework. Hopefully, if they're functioning well, they allow us to communicate, they allow us to create. We need rules, we need these frameworks to be able to build anything meaningful. This is how evolution happens. This is how anything can be created. But we can't hold on to them as objective truths because none of us have that. None of us do. We are all living out the frameworks of our own creation as well as those of society. Language is a framework. It's a concept. Same as mathematics. None of these things are reality. They are hopefully functional frameworks that allow us to build society with. But they all have their weaknesses. And if we believe any of them to be objectively true, then we are bound by the edges of those psychological boxes, This very wise woman last year spoke to me in relation to some of the men's work that I've been doing. And she referred to them as a container. And I would say the same as a concept or a framework or a belief that you have, right? And any of these things, they can be useful for a purpose. If you have a specific goal in mind, you need to create the rules to allow you to create the thing that you want to create. But they also have a shelf life. They all have a limitation. And we need to start realizing that all of our beliefs are only useful for a time, and we need to know how to let go of them and break them to allow us to open up to higher perspectives. When we talk about awakening, so much talk in spiritual community about this great awakening that's coming. And what that actually means is breaking our frameworks of reality, breaking our belief systems to allow us to have a bigger perspective of the world. That's what an awakening is. It's breaking out of our limited beliefs and seeing a bigger picture. And there's always a bigger picture and a bigger picture right up to the top, which is that there's no picture. It's just reality up there. But right now, we're constrained within these frames of reality. And we need to stop holding on so tightly. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed that rant from me. I've got plenty more to say about projection. I really do think it's one of the most important topics that we need to speak about at the moment. So I'll be talking about this a lot more in the coming weeks. If there's anything else you want to talk about, let me know in the comments, and I will see you soon.